Let us recall, this was the time at the height of the Cold War, and the investigations into the death of the UN Secretary General and his entourage touched directly on matters of geostrategic interests in the East-West conflict. Swedish policy at the time was guided to be firmly anchored in the Western European alliance consolidated since World War II. Could this have influenced the position taken? The verdict is pending. But it would be a matter of credibility to seriously scrutinize all documents of the time in Swedish possession without any limitations to access. In the absence of an official willingness to embark on such activity, the Brunegård Group was formed to do its best to reconstruct what unfolded in the context and constellation of the time. It is now for Professor Emeritus Jan Retzer and Hans Christian Simonsen to present some of their preliminary results of the investigations on the way to secure insights, allowing a more reliable conclusion. Like any other society, Sweden should try her best to address unresolved matters in the country's history. The death of Dag Hammarskjöld and 15 others is one of these unsolved cases, and we should find out more.
Thank you very much. And now I give the floor to Professor Jan Retzer, historian and linguist.
Yes, good morning, everybody. First, I want to thank Mrs. Brunegård for the invitation to join this meeting, and together with my friend and colleague from Gothenburg, Mr. Hans Christian Simonsen. The reason for me being here is because I'm a retired professor of Middle Eastern languages at the University of Gothenburg, and I have been working a lot also with history, linguistics and history, and it's the latter aspect of my activity that sort of legitimizes my presence in this assembly, and an interest in the person of Dag Hammarskjöld ever since his death in 1961, which I personally remember very well. Now, when the death of Dag Hammarskjöld in the air crash in September 61 became known in the morning on the 18th of September, he was honored and celebrated as a clever negotiator and a champion of peace by the whole world. He was, correctly, seen as the one who had made great efforts to implement the ideals enshrined in the UN Charter in a more concrete way than had been the case before. And his death was seen as a great loss for the entire world. However, this was not the whole truth. Dag Hammarskjöld had in fact become a controversial figure in world politics by his ambition to transform the UN from a discussion club into a tool by which not the least the minor states in the world would be able to steer world politics, and not the least curb the activities of the great powers. The fact that Dag Hammarskjöld at his death was seen as a disturbing element by all the great powers, the Soviet Union since a long time, even the UK, the US and France, let alone the local powers in the southern parts of the African continent, South Africa, for example. So Hammarskjöld's position in world politics was not so appreciated by the entire world community that might be believed from the praise heard from everybody when he was definitely gone. There's no doubt that in the leading circles of the powers just mentioned, there were many who now felt at ease when the troublesome Secretary General of the UN had left the stage. This is worth keeping in mind when one tries to find out the truth of what actually happened that fateful night. Regardless of the causes behind the crash, pilot error, technical problems, sabotage, or external disturbance, Hammarskjöld was the protagonist in a dramatic period in world politics, and his tragic death was actually also a political event, not an ordinary accident. The political aspect of this event has, from the beginning, haunted the attempts at finding out what really happened that night. The assumption that this was an ordinary air crash was put into doubt immediately, and speculation about sabotage and external attacks on the plane have never ceased. Already the Swedish observers that were invited to follow the inquiries and investigations by local Rhodesian authorities were highly critical about the handling of evidence and the procedures, but it seemed that the local inquirers had decided beforehand that the crash was due to pilot error. This debate was resumed through the activities around back behind the publication of Susan Williams' book, Who Killed Dag Hammarskjöld, in 2011, which was the result of the work of an independent group of people who wanted a reevaluation of the evidence. And the result, as we all know, was that the affair was resumed in the UN, and a special person, Mr. Mohammed Chande Othman, was appointed to re-examine the case. And these procedures are now well known by everybody in this hall. I shall not comment more than that. The main point today is that the possibility of an external attack on the plane has become more likely, and the question is more unsettled than before. The reason for our meeting today is the demand from the special person of the UN, Mr. Othman, to have access to all relevant documentation in the archives worldwide, according to the decision about this case in the General Assembly. On the Swedish side, this resulted in renewed investigation by Mr. Mattias Mossberg, presented in 2019, and which is now one of the merits of Mr. Mossberg's report is that this issue is re-problematized. He clearly states in his report that the causes of the crash are far from being known, and that renewed scrutiny is desirable and necessary. I want to take out 3 points in the conclusions made by Mr. Mossberg in his report, and which I think deserve to be underlined in this context. Point number 1, Mossberg says that there is a growing need for re-evaluation and re-examination of the official versions of the event as they have been presented by earlier investigators, and which has been maintained by important actors until today. This holds for both the reports, what I would call the international reports, that is reports in English, and also some of the Swedish official reports. Point number 2, the documentation investigated by Mr. Mossberg indicates that the probability of external influence on Dag Hammarskjöld's plane that night has increased considerably, and now stands out as much more likely than the more comfortable but unprecise and unproven hypothesis of pilot error. And point number 3, Mr. Mossberg has been able to make his conclusions through renewed scrutiny of some of the Swedish documents. This generates the question about the background of the Swedish standpoints through the years. This deserves further investigation, to quote Mr. Mossberg himself. The Ndola incident, that as we call it, has produced a considerable corpus of documentation. This corpus, which is in our hands today, basically consists of two parts. The material emerging from the activities of the two Rhodesian commissions of inquiry, as well as from the work of the UN Commission on the one hand, and the documents produced by the Swedish participants in the work of the three commissions on the other. To the former belongs protocols, more or less summarized from interrogations of witnesses by the three commissions, as well as their final reports. To the latter group, the Swedish ones, belong the successive reports by the Swedes, the Swedish participants and observers, to authorities at home, as well as a diary kept by some of them during the period when especially the first commission, headed by Mr. Maurice Barber, was working in the autumn 1961. To this is added also promemorias by at least one of the Swedes, Mr. Otto Danielsson. The Swedish participation resulted in a full report by the Royal Swedish Air Authority, Kungliga Luftfartsstyrelsen, mainly based on the successive reports and the diary and other information from the Swedish observers. Mr. Ottman's assignment is evidently to reach a picture of the Ndola incident as exact as possible by renewed scrutinizing of known documents, and eventually hitherto ignored or unknown ones. It might then be remarked that the entire corpus of Swedish documents is, or at least the overwhelming part of it, is not available to Mr. Ottman, since they are in Swedish language. So international investigators are consequently excluded from direct access to an essential part of the documentation of the incident, and have had to, until now, to trust digests and reports from people who had this access. Now, this event, or the incident, between 17th and 18th of September 1961, is a paradigmatic example of a problem that should be dealt with by professional historians. The situation, as I referred to about the documentation, is for a professional historian highly unsatisfactory, since the entire material is not accessible for, and even now, for international scholars. The question is then if there are Swedish documents which contain information hitherto not paid attention to. Now, I have, together with Hans Christian Simonsen, my colleague who has a very thorough knowledge of the material, looked into several documents, and we would claim definitely that there are indeed discrepancies between the Swedish documents and the information presented by the international inquirers, which has not been taken into account. And I'm not going to go into the details here. I'll just let me take one short example. In the report of the first commission, the so-called Barber Commission, there is a testimony of a police officer named Allen, who was one of the first who appeared on the crash site, and he helped the only survivor, Mr. Harold Julian, to be taken to hospital in an ambulance. Now, according to in the Barber Commission's report, in the protocol, there is a contradiction, because in one paragraph it said that Mr. Allen talked to Julian in the ambulance, and it is said that he was in fairly good shape. His pulse was okay. He was badly hurt, but he was okay. Now, in the end of the Barber Commission, it says that Julian, he talked to Julian in the hospital 3 or 4 days later, one day before Julian died, and then he was also in good shape. Now, this is it's somewhat contradictory. And if you look into the Swedish report on this interrogation, it's clearly stated that it goes back to Mr. Åke Landin, who was one of the Swedish observers, who clearly states that according to him, Alan had said that he talked to Julian in the hospital on the September 22nd, that is one day before Julian died, and he was fairly good shape. And he was astonished how it came to pass that he died the day after. So the Swedish document here settles a contradiction in the official report, which is just one example of details which, if you collect many of them, and there are several details, can throw new light on how the reports, the international reports, were formulated. I want finally just make a further comment on Mossberg's point 3. There was a Swedish commission that was appointed to follow the Federal Rhodesian Inquiry Commission, the second commission of inquiry. This Swedish commission was under the special working group, it's called, under the chairmanship of Mr. Rudholm. The Federal Rhodesian Commission concluded its work by stating that there was no reasonable doubt that the cause of the crash was pilot error. During the preceding investigation by the Barber Commission, the first one, the Swedish observers were strongly critical about the procedure of the Commission, as well as what appeared to be a preconceived opinion by the Commission that the cause was pilot error, a conclusion that was followed by the Federal Commission. In spite of the strong criticism by the Swedish observers, the Rudholm Commission, in its final report, followed the conclusions of the Federal Commission closely. No reasonable doubt that pilot error was the cause. Now, Mr. Mossberg expresses his astonishment on this capitulation by the Swedish Commission to the Rhodesians, a capitulation which, remarkably enough, was not followed by the UN Commission, which kept the question more open. Now, Mr. Mossberg does not follow up this contradiction. He has no explanation for it, but as he says, this deserves further investigation. So, to conclude, this opens up another door into the affair, namely the eventual political aspects of how this report and how this documentation was handled by the different commissions involved. And this is what this meeting and what we call the Brunagård Initiative is all about. A renewed examination, as complete as possible, of the Swedish documentation, and making this available to primarily to Mr. Ottman and then to the international public. And as I said, it is quite, for me, as an academic, a scholar and historian, it's somewhat surprising, I would say, in spite of some good critical work made by some of these people who have studied this question, that there is until now, as far as I can see, no real professional historian, maybe except Miss Susan Williams, who have gone into the complete inquiry of the evidence in the Swedish archives. And I think that the time has now come to do so. Now I leave the word to my colleague Hans Christian, who has further comment on what I have said. Please.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everybody. My name is Hans Christian Simonsen, and I am a freelance archive investigator living in Gothenburg. K.G. Hammer, Henning Melber, and I were members of the enabling committee for the Commission of Jurist Inquiry inquiring into the death of UN Secretary General Dag Hammarskjöld 2012-2014. As Jan already said, my private archive is extensive, and my interest in archive investigations for bringing clarity are already well reported. To come back to what Jan said, I would like to stress that the purpose of the Brunegård initiative is to raise awareness in Sweden and internationally about the need for an independent investigation of the Swedish government's working group's role during the Hammarskjöld investigations 1961-1962. The Swedish government working group was formed November 16, 1961, with high-level representatives from ministries of justice and foreign affairs offices, the state police and board of civil aviation, including the justice of the Court of Appeal led by Lord High Chancellor Rudholm. The Swedish government's working group's mandate was to begin with examine and evaluate existing material about the air crash and other available material in the future, and to provide the government its conclusions regarding the crash circumstances and its possible cause, which it would reach. The Swedish government working group was presented by Prime Minister Tage Erlander in Riksdagen November 21st, 1961, and its mandate was now, according to the Prime Minister, to sort out what is probable and reasonable. To bring clarity to the question how and why the Swedish government's working groups sorted out in the report May 2nd, 1962, that the least probable and reasonable cause of the accident was attack or interference by another airplane, shoot down or other interference from the ground, a further systematic investigation of the Swedish National Archives by independent scholars has to take place. This independent investigation would ensure transparency by seeing to that all relevant Swedish official material are fully translated to English, are brought before an international audience, and have reached the ongoing UN investigation into the death of Dag Hammarskjöld and 15 others for evaluation. The independent investigation would also seek to clarify the policy of that time. Of particular interest is to seek for reliable indications and evidence to which extent the geostrategic constellation of the Cold War in 1961-1962 might have influenced the positioning of the Swedish government vis-à-vis Western allies. This could explain the closer alliance with the conclusions of the North Rhodesian investigation report compared with the one presented by the UN established commission. Also, the political and financial framework 1961-1962 and 1992-1993 should be answered. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would you give some remarks, please, Henning?
I'm sure the two speakers have provided sufficient food for thought and incentives for a lively exchange for the next couple of minutes, for which we have put aside the necessary time. Let me just recapitulate some of the substantive issues which come into the picture. As Jan Retzer stressed, Dag Hammarskjöld's popularity was not internationally shared. It was widely considered by the late 50s, early 1960s as the Secretary General of those countries who have no voice in the international community. Put in today's terminology, one could say Dag Hammarskjöld then was what we call today an anti-hegemonic international civil servant. He spoke truth to power, inasmuch as he had internalized the fundamental values of Swedish civil service of the 19th and the early 20th century, to serve the general public interest. And for him, the Charter of the United Nations was a secular Bible, and many called him a secular pope. He insisted that those who subscribed to the Charter should be held to task when they violate the fundamental values and principles of the Charter, which he did, which had made him no friends in the East nor in the West when it came to the big powers then. So, many, while not openly celebrating the death of Hammarskjöld and the 15 others, with the exception of the settlers in the white minority regimes in Southern Africa, who popped champagne when the news broke, many others, most likely, were not really considering it as the loss they pretended in their official obituaries when they gave respect and recognition to the values Dag Hammarskjöld lived for and died. The presentations have summarized some of the contradictions and flaws when comparing the initial inquiries and the follow-up, in contrast to what the more recent investigations taking off 10 years ago with Susan Williams' book, and then anchored and entrenched in the official investigations, which were then mandated to Judge Ottman, have also provided. There are contradictions, there are flaws. Now the big question is, if we look, for example, at the Swedish government working group, were their striking deviations the result of sloppiness, or were they deliberate? This is the major challenge to establish. And we in the Brünegard Group are convinced it is actually the obligation of a Swedish government today to clarify, whichever the result is. Maybe it was just sloppiness. But we need to find out the reasons that explain the deviations already existing then, and basically reinforced by another report in the 1990s, which again remained unchallenged and was considered the official version of what happened then. As we know now, and the Swedish government accepts, what the Swedish working group then called the least probable cause, meaning external influence on the crash, has now, given the evidence compiled, turned into the most probable cause. That is an obligation to find out why the original findings of the Swedish official undertakings have fallen so short of what already then the official United Nations inquiries have indicated. If they would have not been more open, we would not have, since 5 years, a new investigation by the United Nations, because the decision of the General Assembly was based on that first report, which, when adopted in the General Assembly, said if there is new evidence justifying the reopening of the investigations, then it's at the discretion of the General Assembly to take such a decision. The UN General Assembly, with the active role of Sweden played, has taken that decision. Sweden should live up to that initiative by also playing an active role in revisiting the Swedish policy at the time.
Thank you very much. And now there is time for questions. We will try to answer them to our best ability. Are there any of the...
Not
yet.
Not yet, but they can speak to so that we can hear in the hall here.
If there is anyone looking at this event by Zoom, you can either write in the chat or find the raise hand button. That's even better. But now I give the opportunity to the audience.
Well, can I ask a question? I'm a journalist and I'm doing a documentary about Hammarskjöld, as you know.
Please use the microphone, please.
Can I talk here in the microphone?
Hi. Are you implying that the Carl Bildt government of the early 1990s had an interest in not exploiting the truth? I mean, we know that this was a time when the Soviet Union had just collapsed. And Carl Bildt was very pro-NATO and very pro-Western, as everyone knows. And so the Russia investigation might have had a geopolitical aspect there.
At this moment in time, we are not implying anything. We are urging that investigations are properly undertaken, which provide the necessary evidence to draw conclusions. That's the mandate or the intention of this group.
If there are more questions, so please feel free to ask.
Nothing from the chat.
Nothing from the chat. Yes, please. Yes, please. Come forward, please, in order to be heard by everyone. The microphone to the video is connected to this one.
No, it's a speaker, and I think even if you're sitting there, you can still be heard
But
into.
it cannot be seen.
But you cannot be seen, of course.
Most welcome. I wasn't able to greet you when you arrived.
Sorry, we went to the wrong entrance.
No problem. Now you're here.
Chairman, thank you for the floor. My name is Matthias Mossberg, and since my name was apostrophed a couple of times here, I thought I should just say a couple of words of clarification. First of all, I would like to congratulate you to this initiative and wish you all success in your endeavors to carry this issue forward. It's an issue that is important for all of us, as for all of the Swedish people, and should be for also all peoples in the world, really. And it's extremely important that we come to further clarity in this. No one would be happier than myself if you could carry these issues further. I would just like to while at the same time encourage you in your efforts, also give a word of caution that on the one hand, I came to the conclusion early in my work, and I devoted 2 years to go into just the Swedish archives, that one's hopes should, after all, be limited in order not to delude oneself here. And I would like to point out that I had made sure that I got access to all the available material as a condition, more or less, of taking the job. I asked that there was a special decision about access, and the Swedish government actually took a special decision just referring to me, giving me access to all material concerning this, which was somewhat of a unique character. And I'd like to point this out, and that also that I did not have any reason to doubt that I was actually given access to all this material, and particularly since there was in the press some hints that I should have said things to the effect that I was not given access to all material. I strongly take issue with that, and I have talked to the journalist in question who immediately withdraw that. And agreed that he shouldn't have written that without checking with me. That's a small issue, but still I want to underline that I'm still of the opinion that I had no reason to believe that I was not given access to all material. But this is not to say that another approach, a broader approach, an approach by historians, by other avenues into the topic, cannot give further material. I think I was the one that discovered these discrepancies that you have elaborated upon here, and I made a big point of them. And when I saw that, I actually asked the government to give me a supplementary task, which I did also in the second part of my job, which is of my report. So it was two different reports, really. One to the United Nations, making sure that the UN was given all available material in the Swedish archives, and the second one to the Swedish government, looking in particular at how the Swedish government had handled this in the early stages, against the background of exactly these things that you point out. I made a broader search there myself as well into libraries and memoirs and whatever. I found nothing that could give any substance to answering the questions that we have posed earlier here today. This is not to say that there may not be something there. It is, however, possible that one has to come into the area of speculation here. But if that can be substantiated, that would be, of course, a great success. I think one also has to be a little careful with the words. I noticed that here in the invitation, it is said that the Swedish working group was appointed because of the investigators, that is to say the Rhodesian investigators, attempts to prevent the truth to come up. I think that's, in a first reading, for me, it would be a little bit of an overstatement, and I'd be interested in, and this would be my question, what is the basis for that statement? I'm not quite sure that well, I didn't see anything that pointed to a connection between those early skepticism and this working group, but I may have missed something there. So with these words, well, I would like just to conclude also by saying that in my second report there were two recommendations, and one was based on the observation that given that there is so much time that has elapsed now, there seems to be no reasonable reason to keep any material classified in this matter in the future. And the second one is that all efforts to continue to bring clarity. This should be supported, government and others, also from private individuals. So with this, I would just like to wish you
Thank you very
good
much.
luck in your endeavor.
Thank you very
Thank
much.
you, Lord.
Would you like to ask a question?
Thank you very much. I think that is a question that should be maybe not answered today. I don't have an answer for that. I think that is a question which should be clarified in an independent research to come back to the background of the Swedish working group. That is very important, and then be as clear as possible about their mandate and how their mandate changed and how they actually worked from at least 25th of November 1961. There are changes between 16th of November when that group was formed. Later on 21st, that mandate is a little changed, and just to see how this group worked in practicality, that is very important. So you might be right about that, but I think that is something that has to come back when a further and a better, deeper investigation about the role of the working group is better known to us.
Yeah. Time is running. There are still some minutes if anyone more likes to say anything or ask a question. And nothing on the Zoom.
Nothing.
No. Please. Yes, please come forward.
Well, my name is Uwe Bring, and I've been involved in this, writing a book together with Matthias Mossberg about the Indona incident and so forth. Well, I think it's interesting to note that the Rhodesian and the British diplomacy was a diplomacy of pilot error. That was the message that one wanted to convey to the international audience. At the same time, it's very interesting to see that the Swedish position on the 27th of February 1962 was the opposite one, because at that date, the UN Commission was presenting its findings at a session in Geneva. And at that session, the Swedish diplomat Axel Edelstam was present. And he made the point. He was also the secretary of the Swedish working group. But at that time, he was present as a Swedish delegate. And he made the point that the thing about pilot error was not proven. It was not a sure thing at all that pilot error was the final answer to this matter. Now, that was in February 1962. In May 1962, the Swedish working group is presenting its findings. And then the findings are different, as we know, compared to what Axel Edelstam said in Geneva. So the thing is, what happened in the period between February and May? Because this was something that Edelstam must have been clearly aware of, that there was a change. It was a purposeful change. It was a considered change. My own answer to this is that it's not necessarily so that it was related to NATO friendship and the Western alliance. We wanted to be friendly with them and so forth. I think the answer is more down to to the earth that the chairperson of the Swedish working group was a lawyer. He was a justice chancellor, Sten Rydholm, and he was not, that is my suspicion, he was not happy with the mandate that the Erlander government had given, because the Erlander government wanted the Swedish working group to be an inquiry commission, to turn on every stone, as we say. And Sten Rydholm was, in his professional way, not accustomed to work like that. He was a Swedish judge. He was listening to the different witnesses. He was asking a few questions, but only to the witnesses, not an independent inquiry, not a far-reaching inquiry. That was not the way that Swedish lawyers and judges worked. So he was not so happy with the pressing mandate. And I think he sort of changed the model of presenting the results of the Swedish working group so that it was more in line with his usual working methods. So I don't think this is necessarily related to world politics. It might be related to Swedish bureaucracy and legal habits.
Thank you. That's a very interesting remark, and that also points out the importance of watching and viewing this thing from different aspects, and to remember what the time it happened in. People didn't think and react like they do today. Maybe things have passed throughout 60 years, and on the other hand, we must also take in mind what that decision, the judicial decision, resulted in, the blame and the shame of the crew and the pilot, that they are still living with, and still no official apology to the families, in spite of the foreign minister telling that now we have a different view, and that is why we have supported the UN new investigation. Would you like to give some concluding remarks, please, Henning, before we end up everything? So please wrap it up.
First of all, thank you, Gudrun, for taking this initiative, as you stressed in your introduction, as a representative in the Riksdag who has a mandate from an electorate, the Swedish people. And I think it points to one of the motivating factors of that initiative. The Swedish people, if maybe not for whichever reasons any government of the day, should have a right to know as much as possible about the history in Sweden. And I'm confident not only you sharing with us this hour in the room, but also those online, as far as I know them, most of them, agree with that challenge, which complements the initiatives of the United Nations, who also feel there is more work to be done to reach the most reliable conclusion possible, with all the limitations after 60 years. And I think that's the takeaway, and I'm very grateful for both of your contributions, Matthias Mossberg and Uwe Bring, because you basically reinforce the point that it's not a closed chapter. Whatever the answer might be, we need to invest more efforts, energy, and time to make sure that there is nothing we have not considered or discovered. And I think that in itself is sufficient justification, not only for a member of parliament to take an initiative, but for any citizen in the society to support the search for truth. So thank you again, Gudrun. Thank you all of you in the hall. Thank you all of you online. And let's hope we are able in some time to come to not only share with you an appetizer, but present some more insights which might offer conclusions in whichever way. We don't know. What we know is we want to find out more. And thank you all for the support in sharing that. Thank you.
So thank you again, and we finish the official meeting and the recording now, but of course there is possibility to mingle for a while.